Y.K Choi is a Toronto-based author and educator. Her novel, K's Lucky Coin Variety, was a Toronto Book Awards finalist and one of CBC Book's 12 Best Canadian Debut Novels of 2016. In 2017, the Korean-Canadian Heritage Awards Committee recognized Ann for outstanding contributions to Korean culture within Canada. Ann is also the co-founder of the Authors Book Club, an initiative that connects Canadian authors and readers. In this dialogue, Confucius or Confused, Ann shares her personal experiences and insights from her novel K's Lucky Coin Variety in a discussion of Asian upbringings and the role that Confucianism plays. Ann is joined by a panel of TAIWANfest guests, including artist and curator Alicia Chen, graphic artist and designer Tong Zhou, Miss Chinese Vancouver 2020 Runner-Up Julianne Nieh, and president of the Taiwanese Canadian Association of Toronto, Jean Chen. We thank Ann for her time and sharing her stories and experiences with us today.
Hello, my name is Ann Y.K Choi, and I actually just wanted to begin by thanking the organizers of this event and giving me this space to share my journey as a writer and educator in Canada. I was asked to share the background of what turned out to be my debut novel, K's Lucky Coin Variety, and I was inspired to write the story because when my daughter was born, it dawned on me that I knew very little about the Korean culture. And I remember at one point going to the public library and asking the librarian for a book that on the Korean Canadian experience, and the librarian looked and couldn't find anything, and so I went to the bookstore, and again I couldn't find anything. So I thought, okay, this is interesting, but at the same time I really wanted to tell this story because my daughter saw my parents retired and playing golf and having this life without really appreciating what life was like for us when we first came to Canada. And I really wanted her to understand just my own experiences. First of all, I came to Canada in 1975. And Canada looked very different in 1975. In fact, one of the first things that my family went through, in order for new immigrants to register into a publicly funded school in Canada, we had to have Canadian-friendly names, right? And so my name is Y.K, but the school assigned me the name Ann. And that's how I became Ann. We were told that our Korean names were would only, invite ridicule, and it would be, in our best interest to adopt these new names. And I didn't again realize, the impact this had on my family until I had a kid of my own, right? And then all the energy and effort to go into finding the perfect name for my child. I didn't appreciate that until, what my mother went through. And she went through this 3 times, right? Me and my brothers. And so one of the very first messages that I got was, in order to be accepted into this Canadian society, we had to sacrifice. We have to make sacrifices. And so I think, and again, this isn't until I became an adult and I started reflecting how my attitude towards my identity as a Korean person was formed. And so this story opens, the character is 15 years old when she opens, and one of the very first things that if you were new to the country, you didn't speak English, but you were willing to work really hard, was the variety store. And I think in the late 70s, our family was one of the first to have the corner variety store, right? And I think in the 80s, it was the running joke right? That every corner variety store was owned by a Korean family. And, my friends used to think, oh, it's so cool. You have free candy, you have, free cigarettes, you have whatever you want. What my friends didn't know was how difficult life was when the store opens at 7 o'clock, it closes at 11. I remember when I got married and my husband wanted to, eat dinner with me. And it was such a weird concept, right? Because again, we always ate dinner on the run, so that somebody could always be in the store. And just all the challenges, like I remember, wanting to get married to a white man. That was one of my obsessions in high school because I wanted to lose my Korean last name. And I grew up really, really, really embarrassed being Korean and really ashamed. There was a part of me, and again, I traced it right back now. I traced it back to, it started, the moment that I lost my name. But the little things over the years, right? And having, been educated in the Canadian system. Anyway, I got to the point where I did not want my own daughter to have that experience, right? I wanted her to grow up and be proud of her heritage and her background. The funny thing is, I did end up marrying like a white man, but I had done a lot of growing. I was like 30 when I got married. And so in that, I did a lot of maturing. But it wasn't until my daughter was born that the Korean heritage mattered to me. And it mattered a lot because my daughter is half Irish. It's very easy to celebrate your Irish roots in Toronto. Every year we have the St. Patrick's Day parade. There's Irish culture and heritage everywhere. But it wasn't the same way with the Korean culture. And that's why I wanted to write a book. I wanted to write a book and capture that time. Now, this was before Korea became cool. Because then other books started coming out, right? Where all of a sudden, I don't know if you remember Psy with Gangnam Style. He came out and all of a sudden, he was performing everywhere and people knew K-pop. And then along came K-drama. And people were watching Korean movies and Korean cars and technology like Samsung and LG. So all of these things exploded at the same time as my daughter was growing up. So everything kind of seemed to align. And the funny thing too is I intentionally embedded all this Korean into my daughter's life. She ended up actually majoring in East Asian studies at the University of Toronto, which is so funny because she started studying the Korean language. One of the things that was one of the messages I got when I was in school was that you should really focus on the English language. And so I can carry a little bit of, my conversational Korean is there, but my Korean sucks. And one of the big things, I'm sure as everyone knows, is that without language, you cannot become truly immersed or part of a culture without language. So she started studying the Korean language. My daughter has been to Korea more times than I have. And the funny thing is, she started studying Chinese, Japanese, and Korean history, East Asian studies. And all of a sudden, she was telling me about the great thinkers. And again, I grew up here. I didn't know any brilliant East Asian philosophers, economists, scientists. I grew up not being exposed to any of them. So when she started educating me in Asia's contributions to the world, I felt like my mind just blew up. And it was incredible. But one of the big things that I came to realize was the impact that Confucius had on Korea's current state of almost everything. And it was interesting because when the organizers of this event approached and said, I think this year's theme we want to talk about is Confucius or confused. And I thought, oh, wow, that's interesting because I've kind of been thinking a lot about this, and I am no expert on the subject matter. I am learning it. I'm fascinated by it. For a while, I went from Confucius to confused and then to really angry because I started understanding why I did certain things. Like, for example, like in the Korean culture, this sense of hierarchy is so embedded in the culture that, like, if you're sitting at a table, until the oldest person starts eating, nobody eats. The youngest person has to serve everybody. I remember when I was very small, the first time I saw a globe was in a Canadian school. And I was so fascinated that the world was round. And I remember looking at and realizing all the oceans connected. And the teacher came by and asked me, oh, do you know how many oceans there are? And again, I said one, because I saw this one body of water. But the teacher said, no, there's 4 oceans. And then she taught me them by name, the Pacific, Atlantic, etc. And in my mind, I thought it was wrong, right? Because I saw they were all interconnected. But I went home and my mom said, and this is how I realized how immersed in this Confucius, Neo-Confucius thinking she was. It's like, you can never question or challenge your teacher, right? So that was one of the key messages that I learned from her. And so, and again, it's not until recently that I realized, again, all the small little layers, right? So I was wrong. There is 4 oceans. And I think I just, again, all of these things snowballed. And so just internalizing the Confucius code of ethics, we're looking at the virtues, and just, again, accepting without question. So then I got really angry, right? So then from Confucius to confused and then angry. And then I think I am coming out to a place where I feel now a sense of calm. And I think if we're focusing on our C words, right, Confucius, confused, I think I'm reaching a state of calm where I am now beginning to appreciate things a little bit more and not to just be so dismissive, because I think initially I really was. I am unfamiliar with how other Asian languages work, but I do know that, for example, in the Korean language, and although my Korean sucks, it was my native language because it was a language I was first exposed to for the first 7 years of my life. And so we know that language has a huge impact on thought and thought processes. And if the Korean language, again, that hierarchy is built into the language, right? There is a strict code of honorifics. When somebody younger speaks to somebody older, the use of honorifics, like similar to, I think, the French tu and the vous, but it's like much stricter. And gender and age and all of that play into it. So looking at the impact of language, right? And again, that hierarchy. And I remember, and again, I couldn't name why I was angry or confused when I was writing the book, but even in the book, I have a line where I say, I love the English language, because the English language, unlike the Korean language, equalizes everyone. Nobody talks up or down to, you could talk the same way you would to a professor that you would your best friend, right? Minus all the slang and whatnot, right? And so the Korean language, the use of honorifics, it's also a very, so in Korea, if you were an only child, you would still say our mother, because there is no my mother in the Korean language, right? My mother is, we don't say, we would have to say 우리. 우리 is our, 엄마, right? So even as an only child, I would, one would say our mother, our house, right? So then this way of thinking, right? The language, how it frames our way of thinking, So I think I've been trying to understand for the longest time why I've been so resistant to learning the Korean language. I keep saying, I've even tweeted out, okay, I'm going to learn the Korean language, but a part of me has been really hesitant all this time. And I think I know why. I think, again, I'm tracing it back to all of this. But I think in my new place where I am now able to be a little bit more critical in my thinking and a little bit more, I guess, just generous of spirit, and realizing that, oh my gosh, a lot of people have done things to move forward. I think the women in Korea, and even historically, for my second book, I had to do a lot of research, and the timing worked perfectly. But the novel that I'm currently working on is set in Korea during the Japanese occupation of the nation. And it was through that I discovered the men really regarded Chinese as the high language, right? Because again, Confucius and all of the Neo-Confucius scholars were writing in Chinese. And so if the scholarly high thinking were writing in Chinese, whereas Korean, Hangul, was considered the low language, the common language, the women wrote in Hangul. But through the years, now everybody writes in Hangul and Korean, it's the Korean language. So it's women who actually developed literature, right, and contributed to translating all of these international works into the Korean language, and really created a worldview for the women. So, and for everyone actually, not just the women. So I think there is a lot of work, really valuable work that has been made. But I think part of me, the reason why investigating and interrogating this whole idea of understanding the impact that Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism has had is just, again, a greater understanding of why I act the way I do and why I do things the way I do, why I think things. And then it actually dawned on me, too, that, you know what? I am a high school teacher. I have been teaching for 20 years now, and a lot of my work is with English language learners. And I think it's really important that we are engaging educators in this conversation as well. One of the biggest complaints that I sometimes get from my non-Asian colleagues is, I love working with, the Asian students because they're so hardworking and they're so compliant. And then I have to take two steps back and really think about this. Is it because why? And then I think about, when I thought there was one ocean, right? And then I was kind of silenced. We are not encouraged necessarily to be critical thinkers or to engage in that kind of conversation. So that's, I think, again, important for educators to be aware of. The other thing, too, is I remember when I was, again, in school, here, eye contact is so important, right? And it doesn't matter if it's somebody older or younger than you. I, for the longest time, had trouble making eye contact with older people. And here, again, I've had, colleagues say, oh, you know what, they won't even make eye contact. Or the big one is thesis statements. Here, when you write an essay, there's a very structured way of writing. And it is, you've got your introduction, and then they want your thesis. They want it there, blatant, followed by your arguments. Whereas I know, for example, in the Korean way of writing, they try very hard to be indirect, right? They think, even the use of the word you, right? I try so hard to avoid the word you in speaking English with Koreans older than me, because I know that it could potentially offend, right? So it's interesting, the little, the little somersaults that we do in our minds to not break etiquette or protocol. But again, unless people know this, how can they support their students, and how can we encourage our students to again, understand each other. Right now, I think Canada is trying very, very hard to create a more diverse, equitable, inclusive society. And I think one of the biggest ways to do that is to really work on our empathy, right? Our understanding, our greater understanding. And that's why when I thought, Confucius and confused, how is that relevant to me as a writer, and especially someone who hasn't really been exposed to Asian education, why should it matter? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it matters. It matters a lot. And that's why I really, really appreciate this opportunity to talk to everyone about this. I'm happy to answer any questions. I feel like I've been talking quite a bit.
Sure. Thank you for sharing your journey, and I really enjoyed it. Especially the point that you mentioned that it was women developed literature back in the old days in Korea, and they created a worldview for everyone. I was really inspired by that. And to our topic today, my question for you is that do you think does Confucianism still have a role in Canadian Korean community today?
It's interesting too because again, like I shared, I came in the 70s and we did the variety store. And the thing about the variety store is it scattered Koreans because you can't have a group of variety stores in a corner, right? So I found one of the challenges was that you had a variety store in Milton, you had a variety store in Scarborough. And so I think in some ways it really fragmented the community. And so I did not have a lot of opportunities to engage with other Korean families. I think where most people met other Koreans was through church, right? And I think church became very, very important. Now, my parents were Buddhist, so we did not go to church. And so I feel like in some ways I really missed out on that social interaction. But at the same time, right now, I do know that actually it will be really, really interesting moving forward because many young Koreans, like my daughter is now 22 years old, a lot of them do interact with other Koreans, but I find it's more, because again, it's almost like competing social identities. Here everyone is regarded as equal, right? And so like there isn't that built-in fear like you might have when you have a strict hierarchy, right? Where you have to listen to your father or your mother. And I actually consciously raised my daughter so that she is much more critical of and an independent person. I think moving forward, I don't know if I have an answer for you other than I think this generation, though, has a much more superficial appreciation of what it means to be Korean. Because, again, without really understanding, why K-drama or the history of anything, without any real appreciation of the geopolitical or history of Korea, they're just eating the Korean food and thinking this is really cool. I do know that to be the case because my daughter said first year Korean, it was full. There was a full waiting list. But then as the course progressed and you had to actually learn the language, the dropout rate was high, right? Because again, they wanted to know how to read a menu, but they didn't want to know how to read a book necessarily, right? So again, I think yes, there is an appreciation of the Korean culture, but it's not like a deep dive into understanding the impact of Confucian history, neo-Confucius scholars or whatnot. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. That was good. Especially great from personal experience. And you also mentioned that your daughter actually studied the language, even the East Asian studies, and she mentioned quite a few of the great thinkers of China, Japan. which was very surprising to me because most people, they only talk about the K-pop and the K-drama. I was wondering who were the great philosophers that she especially admire.
So I don't know if that's right. So one of the things that like my daughter really opened my eyes to were like women in Korean history and the impact that they had in developing the Korean culture and really just challenging the whole concept of modernity and the role that women play. Yeah, it's and again, I am absolutely no expert in this, but I'm just now beginning to learn. Like for example, I also learned that Catholicism became very, very it's actually very big. Christianity is very, very big in Korea right now. And again, it was largely the women who embraced the religion because unlike Confucianism, which had the strict hierarchy, the missionaries who came said that everybody is equal in the eyes of God. And this was the first time that women could be seen as equal in the eyes of anybody. Right? So then all of a sudden, all these women started embracing Christianity because it gave them a sense of power and voice that they did not have within the strict, rigid system that they knew before. So again, I just thought it was interesting to learn from my daughter about some of the key women who played that role in terms of developing religion and literature in Korea. 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요. 오늘 만나게 돼서 너무 반가워요.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're with us.
Thank you. Yeah, so the question that I have for you was actually kind of related to what we were talking about with K-pop and K-dramas. I'd say I'm in the generation where it's definitely very popular, and many of my friends, they're big fans of K-pop, and I myself, I enjoy making K-pop dance covers. But I've also taken Korean history class in university, and also I've been to Korea several times. So I think that I'm able to see both sides. And I'm curious for you, if you think that this rise in this more in like the entertainment area of Korea is it a positive things for Koreans living in Canada and for Koreans living abroad? Or do you think that it can kind of skew what it really means to be Korean? And for yourself, since you grew up like in Canada during a time where it wasn't as cool to be Korean, do you have mixed feelings personally?
Actually, that's a great question. And your Korean is excellent. Your Korean is better than mine. That's great. I'm so glad.
Thank you.
You know, it's interesting because on one hand, I'm tremendously grateful that Canadian society has embraced the Korean culture, because it just, especially having grown up where I felt largely invisible. So on one hand, I am just thrilled because again, my daughter gets to see it. And it's amazing too because I teach, and it's nice to have other students appreciate, right? And just ask me questions like, how do you say hello in Korean? And I love to engage with students like that. So I think it's great. I am a little, I guess where I am concerned is it does again go back to, it's a real, in many cases, I feel it's a very superficial appreciation for the culture, right? And so it's like jumping on the bandwagon and it's considered hip and cool, which again, it doesn't last, right? Like it comes and goes in waves, whereas I really hope, like with my daughter, that her appreciation for the Korean culture is a lasting one, right? And that with other people too, is that they are able to engage with the culture, with the heritage, and really understand Korea's place in the world. So I'm grateful, but I'm also a little concerned, right, too, that it's become also so commercialized, right, where you could just buy this and buy that, and I worry about that too, and it doesn't, I guess, bottom line for me is I hope it doesn't come to a point where it's no longer authentic, and that we don't have everyone appropriating, right, bits and pieces of a culture that really, for someone like me who has struggled to find my place in that culture, and to really work on what it means for me to, be part of that, and to embrace that as my identity. Like, it's work for me. So to have somebody kind of like wear it and toss it, right, away, it's I don't even know the right word for it. It's beyond. It's like a slap in the face almost, right? Because it's like so yeah. So, but what I hope though is that by talking about it, right, and engaging young people especially, right, like is okay. So, oh, you love the food. That's excellent. Have you ever tried making the food? And then again talking about, like, for example, kimchi, right? And did you know that, like, most families have their own secret recipes? And then really, like, going into, well, did you know that, like, my family, because again, we didn't have refrigerators back when we were in Korea. We would have to bury it, right, underground to keep it cold, and that a lot of families use those pots to store valuables when the Japanese invaded the country. And then all of a sudden you are now delving into, right, the culture, the history, and engaging. I think this is great in that we can take parts of what's happening now if we can kind of steer it in a way that that allows us to engage in better conversations. So again, bottom line for me is I think that opens room for empathy and learning. And then in turn, I'd love to learn something about, you, right, and your culture and your experiences, right? So I think, again, if it leads to some sort of new learning, new engagement, I think it's good.
I agree. Thank you for sharing. I also think that right now with, like, all the entertainment in Korea, it is a little bit of a kind of the result of all the, like, many years of hard work that Korea went through, like, from being a poverty-stricken country to where it is now. So I also hope that people can use this as an introduction to, like, all the history that Korea holds. Yes, thank you so much for your talk today. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'd say that in a way, Taiwan and Korea are quite similar in how they, like, rose, like, they started from being, like, very poverty-stricken, but currently, like, they're both, like, in terms of economy, I'd say they've kind of risen very fast. And in terms of culture, they're both very much appreciated in the world. So I think that has been quite interesting. I'm not sure if you've felt that, if your Taiwanese students feel that way about their culture.
It's one of my experiences with not just my Taiwanese students, but with my Asian students. And again, I think this goes back to what we were talking about with this whole Confucian and Neo-Confucian way of thinking is I sense there's a huge sense of burden that a lot of my students face or bear, because there's this sense that, oh, you know what, our parents sacrificed everything to come to Canada to give us a better life. And now that I am a parent, and I feel like I'm 53 years old, so I feel like I've earned the right to say this, but I have been telling my students that, and especially my Asian students who have immigrated, that no, you don't owe your parents anything. And this is a bit controversial because it goes against the grain of this whole the family unit and this hierarchy, and you have to look up to your parents. And my messaging is, you should always respect your parents, right? There's and you should honor your parents. But I think we have to start, or at least for me, the messaging is that they made these choices, right? You don't owe them anything. And this took me a long time. And I'm borrowing from, there's a movie, and it's an old movie with Sidney Poitier. And he is a black actor, and he falls in love with a white woman. And at one point, he tells his dad, because his dad worked like crazy to give him a better life. And he says, yeah, Dad, I owe you nothing. You worked hard because you were meant to work hard. Just like I will work just as hard for my child, right? And I remember, oh my gosh, that would like blew my mind, because it just went against, and I thought, okay, maybe somebody non-Asian can say that out loud, but somebody Asian can never say that out loud. That's what my initial thinking. But then when I became a mother, when I became a mom, and when I started, again, just really thinking about what experience I wanted my daughter to have and the relationship that I wanted with her, I was adamant that I did not want her to feel any sense of obligation or a sense that she did anything because she owed me. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think, and again, we respect and honor each other, right? But with my Asian students, and this is a conversation I actually had with one of my students who did immigrate from Taiwan. And again, it wasn't an easy conversation because I think it's so ingrained in us that, no, you don't understand, miss. You don't get it. My parents did everything so we could come to Canada. And I think he felt he had to be like an engineer or some sort of professional, whereas he was such a gifted musician. I teach at a performing arts school, and I know that he also loved to act. And I wanted to encourage him to pursue the arts or whatever he wanted to do. And he was like, no, you don't understand. And I wanted to tell him I understand completely, because I felt for the longest time that I owed my parents. I tried to marry a Korean man, right? Because my parents, I was engaged to a Korean man and it didn't work out. But the sense of, obligation and debt that we shoulder, which is a heavy burden that I would never want to impose on my daughter. So this is a message that I really, really hope that to engage young people with.
Thank you for sharing. And honestly, I can resonate with that so much, because I honestly don't know where it came from, but I'm actually the same age as your daughter, so I'm 22. Oh. Yeah, and then so I recently graduated from university, and I remember, well, to be honest, throughout my entire life, I always felt like I had to work hard and to like prove that I'm worthy. And like looking back, it's hard to pinpoint why that happened. I think it's just something I internalized myself, because after having conversations with my parents, I realized that they never really like told me, oh, you must succeed, you must be this or you must be that. It's something that I put upon myself. But recently, after talking with my parents, they really emphasized that all they've ever wanted for me was to be happy and to enjoy my life here in Canada. And I hope, and I'm sure that many more parents, like Asian parents, share this sentiment. Perhaps they don't really know how to express it, or perhaps it's just not natural for them to share it. But I also hope that more Asian students know that in the end, the goal is to like be happy and not necessarily to feel obligated. I don't think any parent would want their child to feel that burden. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that.
And again, I think you're absolutely right, but I can speak from just my experience, but we rarely talk about our feelings. Like one of the big in school, it's like, oh, go home and tell your parents how you feel, right? Like when I was in high school, and I was thinking, no, I would never. Like we don't do that, right? There's a stoicism almost, right, to this, right? So again, I think this is why it's so important for like us to be talking right now, because again, it opens other people to having similar conversations and insights.
Exactly.
Hi, Ann.
Hi.
Yeah, the conversation I just heard, it's really inspiring. I think right now, I think Canadian, in terms of like Canadian culture, are much more diverse and more welcoming to different cultures. I'm really curious, when you growing up in Canada, did you sacrifice part of the Korean culture that you were taught from your parents, maybe, or maybe when you're growing up, like what part of Korean value or culture you have to sort of compromise in order to fit into Canadian culture, and what kind of part of the Canadian culture, sorry, how can I phrase that? Yeah, so I was just wondering, like, what part of Korean culture or value you kind of have to give up to fit in, and when you recall that, also what kind of Korean culture and value sort of made you who you are today?
Wow, that's a great question. I think negotiating between two cultural expectations is challenging for a lot of people. Like at school, I think one of the things that Canadian educators really value is critical thinking, especially at the post-secondary, where they want you to be an independent thinker. They want you to ask difficult questions. So at school, I was pushed to do that and speak up in class, and it didn't always feel natural. Whereas when I went home, even if I had a question, a legitimate, like, this doesn't make any sense question, I couldn't ask that question. My dad is, I don't want to say he's like a stereotypical Korean man, but he really, I think, prides himself on being the head of the household. Even when he's talking gently, he sounds like he's shouting, right? It's just his demeanor. And so at home, it was just being very compliant and quiet, and not wanting to do, like things like here, girls would date, they would want to just go out and do things. So at home, I was this one person, and then at school, I was trying to be this sounds strange, as white as possible, right? Again, to kind of just fit into that. And the older I got, the easier it was to fit into the dominant white society, because I had access to the language. I was educated here. I could speak to, current events, anything that was happening here. So as time went, it was harder and harder to really see my Korean self. It wasn't until my daughter came along. It's funny because I think my parents are more fond of my daughter than they are of me. Like, it's really interesting, the dynamics between like a grandchild and a parent, right? So then all of a sudden, my relationship with my parents evolved again, because then all of a sudden I had an authority I didn't have before, because I was now a mother. So all of a sudden I had a voice that I didn't have when I was just a child. So again, it's fascinating how this hierarchy works. Is that all of a sudden, also too, now that I'm older, it's interesting because one of the best things I think about being an older Korean woman is that you have more power in conversations, because now almost everybody younger than you has to talk up to you, including the men, right? So again, but my relationship with my parents, and that keeps evolving because I am aging, and again, the status as a married woman, my status as a mother, and also as an educator, because Koreans value education so much. It's a title given to you. Here, you know how it's only, I think doctors are the only people given a title in Canada. In Korea, 선생님, teacher is a title.
Right.
That's right up there.
Yeah.
Right. So
I think Asian culture in general really respect educators, teacher, professor, like people, like I think in general Asian culture look up to these people, intellectuals.
And one of the things that I have been really working on as an educator myself is I remember when I first started teaching 20 years ago, I loved when the kids were compliant. I loved it when the kids listened to me. But now I prefer when students actually challenge me, right? I encourage students to openly engage with me in especially if they disagree with me. So this is another thing that I think I'm really trying now to bring my Asian self and my Canadian self together as one. And in the classroom, I see it most, I think, when I am speaking, because they know I look like an Asian person. So for me to be telling my students of Asian background, it's that, you know what, it's okay, challenge what I'm saying to you. It's and you know, it's interesting, once upon a time, I used to think a quiet classroom was the best. That to me meant the teacher had good classroom management skills and the students were learning. And now I realize that's so wrong. The best learning environment is where the kids are loud and asking questions and challenging each other and engaging in conversation, right? It's taken me a long time because, again, quiet was always embraced, right? That hierarchy and not challenging authority. So
right.
I feel now I'm becoming more and more my authentic self, especially in the classroom. Yeah, but it's been a journey. It's taken me a long time to get here.
And when did you find yourself that the Korean version of Ann and the Canadian version of Ann sort of emerged together? When did you realize that? Or maybe they're still part of Korean Ann, or a little bit the Canadian Ann still exists?
You know, I realized it when I actually started seeing it on paper, because then the publishing industry started labeling me as the Korean Canadian author, and it was imposed upon me. And again, initially, I wasn't happy, because I thought, you know what, if it was a white writer, you wouldn't necessarily think, you know, an Irish Canadian author or American, right? They would just be a Canadian author, right? So
right.
Initially I thought about that, but I've come to the point where now I'm actually proud of the fact that I have these two identities, because both of them inform who I am, right? And again, it's such a fluid movement back and forth between. Like, for example, right now, when I'm speaking with other Asian people, right, I feel pretty relaxed, right? And I feel like, okay, because I think there's a common understanding, and with that, there's a comfort. Whereas I generally speak to a predominantly white audience, right? My books are written for white readers, I think, because again, the Korean readers already know the experience. They did the variety store. They know what my story is about. It's really the non-Koreans that and it's when I am speaking to non-Asians that I do feel more Korean than ever, right? Because again, I'm that fluid identity moving in and out. But I find too, much of it, that label was one that was imposed on me.
Thank you. I don't know if this question sounds a little bit tricky. We were discussing about Confucianism, and one big part of Confucianism is that it encouraged people to be mediocre. And but then when we look at Western cultures, it's about express yourself, find your own identity, almost like trying to highlight yourself, standing out yourself, but versus the mediocrity that the Confucianism, I think there's a big influence on a lot of Asian cultures. That's why we're usually shy. We don't speak up for ourselves, or we usually don't want it to be the very visible one. Do you think that still have a value in the modern society to be mediocre? Obviously, I consider you are pretty successful as a Korean Canadian in Canada, and I just don't know if you see mediocrity has certain value anymore.
If I kind of flip that a little bit, I think we're looking at this whole idea of the collective, right? Is that like we're part of the this group, and again, it's like our house versus and our mother, and I think it has served the Korean as a country well. Because I think it's again this collective, like we are all one mentality that allowed the country to build its economy as quickly as it did. And again, not challenging authority, right? And really moving forward. So, and because along with that too is this idea of committing to hard work, working really, really hard, right?
Yeah.
For the betterment of the group, right? So I think, again, there is strength in that. But the challenging part is here when in Canada, where we really, really value independence and critical thinking. I think it was the latest Statistics Canada where we looked at, the number of Asian Canadians in Canada versus the number in leadership roles.
Yeah,
right?
I saw that
Right.
too. Yeah.
And we talk about, piercing the bamboo ceiling, and how do we get more people of Asian background into leadership? And I think most people approach this from this there's systemic racism, right? And there's absolutely there is, but I think we have to also look at our cultural background and the impact of Neo-Confucius thinking. So we kind of have to, but I think again, where we are right now, or where I hope we move is increasing our understanding and knowledge of this, right? So that if we are to live in Canada, for example, and have impact and want to contribute to Canadian society on a bigger scale, what needs to change? And again, I think even with Confucianism, right, and then it evolved into Neo-Confucius ideals, right, and the whole concept of modernity. I hope again that things evolve again, right? I think I'm hoping that things keep churning and churning till we get to a place where, because again, I feel like our culture is still, or our collective is still so invisible.
It is.
Right? And so, again, engaging in conversations about how do we pierce out of that, how do we break out of that, and really understanding, as you pointed out, the impact, right, that Confucius thinking has had on our lack of bursting through that ceiling.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I learned a lot from Ann and both of you, the question, and just so inspired, like the both culture, how to emerge, and how are we going to move forward from in the Canadians' life to enhance the Asian culture and Western culture together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Both. I think it's absolutely critical or absolutely beneficial to have, and again, we know that the adolescent mind is so flexible. They could learn up to 6 languages at the same time, which is the practice in several European countries. And we also know from studies that there is many, many, many benefits of having a bilingual brain. But why I think having access to or learning both languages is so critical to one's healthy development is language frames, like we said, thought processes. And language allows us insight into, so like in the Korean language, for example, we have lots of words for rice, right? Like I know that the indigenous people have lots of words for snow, right? But in the Korean language, we have pap, which is cooked rice. We have sar, which is uncooked rice. There's different, and again, so you start to learn what is important to a culture by analyzing the language. And again, it's only by learning the Korean language one appreciates the honorific and the importance that it plays in the language. Just like learning the English language provides insights into the relationships that we, even within the families. I think it's also the case in many Asian languages. But if I name my father's sister's cousin, there's only one, there's actually a word where you would because there's a word for father's sister. In English, you have to say cousin 10th removed or whatever the case may be. In Korea, you'll know there's specific words for in relationship to the speaker, right? So again, language would provide access into how family are structured. And then there's words that only exist in a specific language. Like there are some words in the Korean language that do not have a equal common word in English. It'll take like 5 words to kind of get a nuance of. So again, having access to more than one language, I think is one of the best ways to help promote a healthy social and cultural identity for any individual.
Can I ask one more question? Because we're still kind of in the pandemic, and I remember Ann mentioned you mentioned your mother usually say in chaos seeking opportunities. So I was really curious about and when you look at this pandemic, we consider pandemic as a chaos. What kind of new opportunities that you see will happen in the future, especially for let's say for the group of people like us that kind of blending in within 2 different cultures, or people like you that are focused on education, like writing, creative writing?
It's the best thing that has come out of this for many of us is our ability to engage with people from around the world, right? I have been able to do talks, and again, I've been very, very fortunate since I started writing. I ended up signing with Simon & Schuster, which is a big publishing company, and so I've been fortunate in being able to attend book talks and events across Canada and parts of the U.S. But again, that's very, very difficult, time-consuming, and whereas now, right, this platform, I never heard of Zoom until the pandemic, and I sucked at technology, and I did not like online meetings. I had to have my daughter help me with tonight, but I think it's great because again, it allows us to engage in conversations and really meaningful conversations. And it's not the same. It is not the same as face to face, but but it's still an opportunity, right? And sometimes we talk to people that we would never have had a chance otherwise. And I think it's the same thing too. Actually, my mom just finished her first creative writing course, which at the age of 78, she completed her first, and my mom has mobility issues. And if she wasn't able to do it on Zoom, she wouldn't have had that opportunity. And some of the, and she learned it in the Korean language, right? But some of the, her instructors were from Korea, zooming in to her class. So it's provided her with incredible opportunities that I don't think people would have thought to offer online Korean creative writing classes to like senior citizens, right? But again, it's out of the pandemic that somebody thought to do that, and so I think again, there's been some really neat things that have come out. Really, and again too, I've like really enjoyed this conversation with all of you, and I know we're doing it virtually, but I still feel just as buzzed and energized to be engaging with all of you as well. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and it's such a pleasure to meet everyone. Could I ask for something really crazy? Can I take a screenshot and just say, is that okay? Can everyone just smile? Ready? 1, 2, 3.